This is the Torg Eternity Delphi Council Debriefings, where the storm has a name. We are your hosts, Leamon, Jay, and Mark, and today we will be discussing Isle cultures of the Dwarves and Elves. But before we get into that, we do have one email that came since the last time we did recordings. And you can also email us at torgdcd@gmail.com, and you can ask questions, you can make comments, and we will answer the questions to the best of our ability and comment on your comment. So this one here is a question about the Infiniverse Exchange. And it says, "Hi folks, thank you for your podcast and the love you put into this game. After I've heard about the Infiniverse Exchange at the podcast, of course, I noticed that most of it is only in English. While I am quite fluent, my group and GM aren't. To my question, how should I go about if I want to do translations of existing Infiniverse Exchange material? For my group only, I wouldn't bother, of course, but I think many would like to have some German translations on the Infiniverse Exchange. Do I need a formal permit from the corresponding author? Is there a way to share royalties for it? Otherwise, I would just put it out as pay what you want. Kind regards, Daniel." So Daniel, thank you for writing in, and this is kind of a coincidence because before last episode we were talking about this same thing, and Jay actually has a lot of Infiniverse Exchange products, including a lot of different cards, whether they're Cosm cards or various other type of cards, and actually had someone reaching out to him saying, "Hey, your stuff's in English, I would like them in other languages." So Jay, go ahead and talk about how you work that out.
Yeah, so Pierre approached me and said that he wanted to redo my Cosm cards in French, and if I wanted it, like how to go about it. And to be honest, I didn't really care about money or anything. It's not like you really make anything off of these, but he insisted he wanted to also like pay it forward. So I'm pretty sure officially you need to talk to the original author. It is copyrighted under them as well as Ulysses. So you can't just translate it and use all the same stuff and just throw it on there, pay what you want. You want to talk to them. But I would imagine most Infiniverse authors would be totally fine with you making a translation. And if you do want to share royalties, there is a way to do it on DriveThruRPG. If you go into your account page, down at the bottom, there's a section called My Money. And if you click on that under Manage My Royalties, it will show all of the titles that you have. And there is a button to the right on each one that says Split. And if you click that, you can change the percentages of how much people get. So like right now, anything you put on the Infiniverse Exchange, you get 50% of whatever it is. The other 50% is split between DriveThruRPG and Ulysses. But you can then that 50% you can further split amongst multiple people. So for example, each of the French sets of cards, or Italian eventually it went to, I get 20% of those. So the person who translated them gets 30%, I get 20%. You could do whatever you want. If the author doesn't care, I imagine most probably won't, because with this 20%, as of January 2023, I think I made $6 off of those, so it's not a huge deal. I would imagine almost everyone would love for you to translate it. It gets their name out there more and more people playing Torg, but just make sure you do get permission.
Yeah, you can't do whatever you want. That's what you said, but the point I think you were making was that you and the author who owns the IP can split it up however you agree to do it. But you absolutely need to get whoever the original author was, you have to get their permission, because what they created, that's their IP, that's their intellectual property. Now it's Ulysses Spiel's property, Torg Eternity is, But like, for example, the behind me, that's the adventure They. We haven't heard from them. That's a one-act mission that I wrote. That's my intellectual property. Jay made the cards for various cosms. That's his intellectual property. We used Ulysses Spiela's Torg Eternity intellectual property to do that. And so when we put it on the Infiniverse exchange, we do so under an agreement, that a blanket agreement that Ulysses Spiela has with anybody who posts stuff in the Infiniverse exchange on DriveThruRPG, which says that 50% of whatever we list, we can set the price at whatever we want. When we let's say we use $3.99, when you put it out there at $3.99 and someone buys that for $3.99, half that money goes to DriveThruRPG, who then divvies it up between them and Ulysses Spiela the way that their agreement with US is. The other half comes to the author who wrote the IP. In this case, it would be They or Jay's cards. So with your desire to translate it into another language, which I think is fantastic, and I 100% agree with Jay that authors who own stuff like this or anything else in Torg Eternity, I think they would be foolish not to absolutely want to let you do that. But you would have to work with them to come up to terms for you to take their IP and then translate it into another language. I think Jay's 20-30 split's probably not a bad call at all, given if you're going to do all the work, if all you want to do is, here's a file, I give you a file for the mission, or he gives you a file for the cards, and then you do all the work to translate it and you hand it back for approval because it's my IP, I would want to be able to look at it and make sure that you're not doing anything, off the rails with it, and then stamp.
Assuming you can speak French.
Assuming, or
German,
whatever, or however you want to do that. And then you post it on, because you're doing all the work. Sure, I think that's a fantastic idea. You ought to get paid for that because you translated something that wasn't going to otherwise be into that foreign language and open up that market. So you should get something for that. But by the same token, because it's something that I created or that Jay created or that another author created, they need to be paid for that too, because it's their IP. If you don't, then you're just pirating it, and that's bad, and we don't like that.
Yeah, so I'll agree. Once an author or artist makes something, it is copyrighted immediately, and work with the author. But as both Jay and Mark said, I think the majority of authors out there would be more than willing to say, yes, go ahead. Now I don't have to worry about translating it. And it's either, like, I see it as either I'm getting some money or no money. Some money is better than no money, or no additional money. Some additional money is better than no additional money. So I also have the Paraverse up on the Infiniverse exchange. If somebody contacted me and wanted to translate it into a different language, I would be all for doing some type of split or royalty, thing like Jay is doing. If you want to, I don't have a list of like email addresses or anything for Infiniverse exchange authors, so I would suggest possibly looking at the Torg Eternity Discord and seeing if any of the Infiniverse exchange authors on that, as well as there's an unofficial forum on the Piazza. It is at one word, the Piazza, ThePiazza.org.uk, where there's a lot of Torg fans and people who go there, and some of the, I believe, Infiniverse exchange authors might be on that as well. There's a few Infiniverse exchange threads and stuff, and you might be able to reach out there to get somebody. But if you're able to get somebody and they are able to work with you, then yeah, that's all fine and good. I would support that 100% if you get the author's permission. So that's
there you go. There's three of us.
You can also message people in DriveThruRPG. So.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Well, then do that. That's right.
Or drop a comment on YouTube or wherever else and say, hey, I want somebody this thing from one of us, and we'll PM you. And I'm pretty sure we're open to that.
So I'd forgot that you can click the little like email or like message the author thing. So yeah, go for it. seriously, the worst that can happen is somebody says no, and then they probably weren't somebody that you wanted to work with anyway, so move to the next thing. So thank you very much, Daniel, for writing in, and hopefully that answers your question. So now we are going to move into the cultures of the Dwarves and the Elves of Isle, and kind of there are similarity between the Dwarves and Elves of Torg Eternity and those in other high fantasy games, but there also are some various differences. So we will go around and discuss how they work in Torg Eternity and things like that. So we're going to start off with the Dwarves, because there is a link between the lore and even recent lore of the Dwarves and Elves, and it kind of starts off with the Dwarves and then continues into the Elves. So Jay, your thoughts on Torg Eternity Eilish Dwarves?
Well, dwarves in Torg Eternity are a bit different than a lot of other dwarves. At one time, they were, I suppose, your standard traditional Yule dwarf. You probably are still faking a Scottish accent to talk like a dwarf, but I've also known a lot of people that fake a bad German accent for dwarves too instead. But so on Isle, they were mostly underground. They had numerous cities in the land between, and then there were some dwarves that were above ground. Duke Vareth, his clan was one of them, but mostly they were underground, and they tended to stay secluded away from most other happenings. Now we are going to run into one situation here. Probably all three of us, but at least two of us more, probably, is that there's only so much information really given on the dwarves and the elves in these books. There's a lot of ground that these books cover, but there's also the information from the original Torg, many of which is not applicable anymore, but some of it still can be. So a lot of us will be kind of meshing, some things from there along with modern things, and then implications that the book makes. So every Cosmverse is going to be slightly different, and people are going to run games differently. But for right now, as far as I'm concerned, the dwarves, they kind of kept to themselves most of the time. They would deal with elves or humans occasionally, but they were mostly hiding in the land between, from whatever was going on the other side of the world. They didn't really busy themselves too much with what was going on. There was some kind of situation at some point where they pissed off or got pissed off by their gods and forsook them. So that's an interesting thing to also take into account if you're playing a dwarf. They tend to be outsiders. They aren't often allied directly with the light or the dark, and they're not big on the gods. Part of why they're not big on the gods is because the gods did nothing to save them when Uthorian came. And Uthorian came through Isle and basically ravaged them. And the dwarves, if memory serves, I think the dwarves were basically the first. Like, they were the example that was made to everybody else. Like, this is what's going to happen to you. So when Uthorian came, he, it didn't seem like much at first, but this army of the dead and army of the dark kept growing and growing, and the dwarves were fighting to the last, but then their sort of solitary nature kind of got the best of them because they didn't really have any allies, and city after city got wiped out. So whatever cultural traditions there were between the different cities that were, different for each area, whatever stories they had, whatever trades or produce that they focused on, all of that is basically gone now. They were pushed back, they became refugees, many of which ended up in, I can't remember the name of the city now. There was the one last dwarven hold, starts with a G, I think, but eventually, the pretty much everything aside from that one city was taken over. And eventually, when Ardenae came to her senses and marched the army of the light into the land between, into the underground to go to core Earth, most of the dwarves joined her. They didn't really have that much left, anyways, and they had basically vowed vengeance against Uthorian and all of Uthorian's lieutenants and like everything. A small amount was left back in the city, but even those, they got overwhelmed by lurks and had to retreat, and also ended up on core Earth. So there's, from my understanding, very few dwarves left in Isle proper at all. They're pretty much all in core Earth, which is a bit different than the elves.
Mm-hmm.
So the dwarves that have come are survivors, refugees. They're embittered. Many of them are wearing this magical battle armor that was crafted by the Sharn Hand, who is essentially the leader of the dwarves on core Earth now. They've mostly settled in Scotland, in Glasgow, I think. Most of the dragon warriors, the people who joined the Order of the Dragon, which was a set up after their cities were sacked, as the dwarf would. It's kind of, but not really. Kind of like the Slayers from Warhammer,
Mm-hmm.
a situation where they take upon themselves a vow that they will get revenge on Uthorian and they'll protect what's left of the dwarves, and their life doesn't matter anymore. They get the dragon armor, which is this incredibly powerful runic armor, but they themselves don't really have any honor. They let themselves go. Their beards are shaggy, their hair is like wild, but then they have found in core Earth there is glory to be had and honor, and they've started now to actually kind of come around. Their colonies in Scotland are actually growing, and there's actually, in my game anyway, a bit of a feeling of some kind of hope creeping in, but still one by one the dragon warriors kind of are falling, piece by piece. So that's the big thing about playing a dwarf in Isle. There's this tragic backstory, and you are probably crazily embittered by it. Every dwarf has their own personal story because they can live up to 800 years. So you all experienced this, right? So you were run through the caves, you had to escape into core Earth, you fought alongside the army of the light. It's basically been nothing but nonstop war for you for decades, probably. So this war that core Earth is just finding itself in right now is old hat to you. So keep that in mind for when you're role playing. A lot of the dwarves are probably like not burned out, but they've been going at it for a while. So those are the kind of things that I think of with the dwarves. See what you guys think.
Before I move on to Mark, I did just want to do kind of a little setup at the Cosm of Isle. The world of Isle is kind of in the shape of a donut. You think about it, with the two sides and the land between being the underground between the two sides of the donut. In the middle, the hole of the donut is where the sun rises, and it goes through the hole to the one side, and then it's day on that side, and then it goes through the hole on the other side, and then it's day on that side. And both Jay
There's
and
your
Mark
picture.
are showing the picture from the classic Torg Isle sourcebook. That, again, if you want to dig into things that you might want to use in your own Cosmverse, you might look at that as being the dwarf past and their glory days before Uthorian came and kind of rampaged all over them and almost drove them to extinction. The other thing is, because the dwarves were in the land between, that is kind of Uthorian's way of getting around. So the dwarves were a thorn in his side. They did not bend to him, and therefore they needed to be eliminated, because he uses the land between as a staging point for his maelstrom bridges. Instead of them coming out of the sky like pretty much all the other realities that invaded Earth, they came from the underground through the land between. So it was like a underground maelstrom bridge connecting to the underground cave systems and subways and stuff in the Isle realm on core Earth. So I just wanted to kind of get that background of why Uthorian felt that the dwarves, not just, oh, they're really good fighters and stuff, so I need to take them out, but they were in an area that he felt he needed, and then them fighting against him and not bending knee, they made a really good example of why you don't oppose him. So, Mark, your thoughts on the dwarves?
Dwarves as refugees in Torg Eternity is pretty much the way that I look at them. Having had pretty much everything that they ever knew back on Isle obliterated, destroyed, overrun in the hands of the enemy, however you want to look at it, that's pretty much, all of the holdings, old school House Verith, everything's been taken from them. And the dwarves that are on core Earth now are the ones that didn't get killed in Isle. And so they have this shame. It's not, they have they've been dishonored because they feel like they've been dishonored, or that they are dishonorable because they failed to stop Uthorian from destroying their homes. So all of those, if you go to Tolkien or Lord of the Rings in the movies and everything, all of that stuff underground, that's the dwarven this and dwarven that, that's all been overrun, and they weren't able to hold it, to stem the tide of evil. And so they all pretty much feel this sense of shame and guilt for that, which is the whole point of the bearded perk, which I think, in my opinion, for the dwarves when I run it, is integral to who the dwarves are. And I think from a game master standpoint, one of the things that you want to have ironed out before you start presenting your dwarves is where they stand with that particular portion of it, because the bearded perk is a cool perk, and I got to plug my headset in or it's going to turn off. Bearded perk is a cool perk, but it carries with it a lot of RP stuff, because your dwarf, your unbearded dwarf who's shaggy and unkempt and doesn't really care, is kind of depressed because of the whole thing that went on in Isle. And you have a really cool moment in game when that dwarf can take the bearded perk, because if you check out the prerequisites, I believe that they have to play glory in order to be able to take that perk. So if you're playing a dwarf from a player's perspective, I think that the bearded perk ought to be, every dwarf ought to have that bearded perk in their tree that somewhere, because I need to get, as a dwarf, I need to get my honor back. And they work into the beard once they're bearded gems and jewels. Like I have, my guy does the character that I've got has a little shield that represents his clan. That's important for dwarves to me, but the dwarves love complicated mechanisms, things that underground traps, underground stuff. They are, you can look at them as the guerrilla warriors in the land between. You might want to have an understanding of how you want to have your dwarves, how populous they are in your world. Are there a lot of them? So you have a lot of dwarves that escaped. Are there very few? So dwarves are very rare. And that works for the dragon armor too. The dragon warriors, were they driven out, and so there are lots of them running around? Because dragon armor, from a player perspective, dragon armor is really cool. You can do a lot of stuff with it. You can wade into combat and take a lot of hits and shrug off a lot of damage, and you can be the tank that anchors the bad guy right there and lets other people burn him down and just take hellish amounts of damage and deal out some of it too, because dwarves are designed for that melee combat. They're really good at that, among other things. So are your dragon warriors like the high fantasy knight, so to speak, where they're very few and far between, and so it's very unique to see dragon armor strolling around, or is it very commonplace? Um, they are um, very interested, in my opinion, very interested in reclaiming the heritage that was lost when Uthorian overran everything they had. So think about all of the places that growing up in your life, the places that the cities that you hold dear, and the places that you've been, and some of the capital of your state or your province or of your country, and that's all gone for them. So there's no pride in nation anymore. But when they find a piece of it and can reclaim it and bring it back to the clan, then that's a big deal for them, because they got, someone brings an artifact that was in the capital city, and they all of a sudden or House Vareth, this is, a battle flag that flew, whatever. Oh, that's a big deal for them. So you can weave that in there too as a nice piece of flavor for your dwarfs. Um, they're not really, I mean, I kind of just take the old school dwarves and giants don't get along, just because it's just classic. And I don't know that Torg Eternity really has anything that strings that together, but it just feels right. So I always have the dwarves and giants not get along, and the dwarves love to take it to the kneecaps of the giants just because they're dwarves. So
So yes, I'll add to what Jay and Mark said, and try to bring in a couple other points. Even the dragon warriors do the unbraided thing where they're all disheveled, and they usually don't even take off the armor, or extremely rarely, because it hides their shame, or what they consider their shame. And going along with the gods didn't help us, so we don't need the gods anymore. There are a few perks where the dwarves get, like Forsaken and God's Bane and God's Scourge, that they can get bonuses against miracles and the faith perks and stuff, and miracles don't affect them as much. So they've kind of even taken it further as being anti-deity. And then they have another cool thing as rune makers. So there are still a few of them that know how to do the runes, which are similar to, say, alchemy from Aurorsh, where they can produce different runes that have different effects, and they break them and those effects happen. So that's all cool. Going back with the dragon armor, just a point over Jay's shoulder, he has a whole that's a book, right? With perks and stuff for dragon warriors.
Yeah, it's. Oh,
there you go.
Yeah,
Storm
so
Night
it's
Sky.
new perks for dragon warriors, new upgrades to dragon armor, new runes, combinations of runes with dragon armor, and other just dwarf and outsider stuff too.
Right, and
I was also going to mention, I didn't know if you were done or not already, but I did find it. The dwarf city is Cariarda.
okay.
Cariarda. Right. It is with a K. And I think one of the most important things, if you have a dwarf character, is when did you come to Core Earth? That's a big question you should ask, because most came with Ardenay during the initial invasion, but there was a lot that stayed behind in Cariardar, and it fell 6 months into the war.
Mm-hmm.
So the final batch of dwarven refugees arrived at in the 6 month mark of year one of the Possibility Wars. So if you were a dwarf, if your character, if the campaign you're in is taking place later than that, your character might be fresh to the Possibility War directly from Isle. And so that could be a very interesting tack to make it. But as Leamon was kind of implying about the Dragon Warriors book, I was very interested in the dragon armor and the whole Order of the Dragon. It was just sort of mentioned a little bit offhand along with the Sharn hand. So I kind of extrapolated on that and built on it in this. It's in no way official, but one thing I assumed kind of is that the original Dragon Forges were in Cariadar, and they were lost when the city was lost. But since then, like by the end of year one, they've managed to build new ones in Glasgow. So now there can be more dragon armor with more crazy core earth improvements possibly coming out. So there's different ways to go. And the other one, we've said the name a few times that I think is really cool and has not been touched on yet, is the Mad Duke, Vareth, who, which ironically in classic Torg, they were like evil dwarves. They were like a bunch of slavers on the surface. They were bad to begin with. But in Torg Eternity, they were like a noble, good house of dwarves, just one of the only ones that lived above ground. But they got completely wiped out, and they basically all died to a man defending their duke who escaped into the land between, and then he kind of went crazy and has now been building all of these clockwork automatons, like dragon warriors with no dwarf in it. It's just clockwork. And it always makes me think of the Dwemer cities in Elder Scrolls.
Oh, right, yeah.
When you go into them and it just feels like, I think that's what I think going to Scarp and the Mad Duke's Citadel would be like. And I really want to use them a bit more sometime in the future. So there's a lot of stuff you could do as a dwarf character.
Yeah, and
just real quick, keep in mind, day 181, Cariadar, the last dwarven stronghold in the Land Between Falls. Day 192, the survivors appear near Glasgow and aid the Earthers in retaking the city. That's in your Aylse,
So 192.
Yep.
So the last thing I would add for going with the Dragon Warriors and reminding people that Isle isn't exactly your typical high fantasy. The tech is high enough for primitive firearms up to wheel lock mechanisms, and that also could be used to understand why are these dwarves carrying flamethrowers. Well, that's around the same time that Greek fire was, the Byzantine Empire had Greek fire in the Middle Ages. So that, to me, makes even normal technological sense. It doesn't have to be how come they have flamethrowers, because we have depictions of Greek fire in both paintings and in sculpture where it's shown to be destroying and catching ships on fire and stuff. So that's how I kind of view it. I don't necessarily need that big of a suspension of disbelief with the tech level.
Well, I mean, it is magic.
Yeah, the armor and stuff is magic, and that's probably how it keeps it, running. But just a flamethrower type substance was primitive. What, even though we don't have the exact formula for it, most scientists, archaeologists, historians think that it's some type of napalm or petroleum substance that was used that was more than just lighting some oil on fire. So let's then take what happened to the dwarves and show how that affected the elves, because the almost complete destruction of the dwarves is a reason why the elves came to Earth, core Earth, and are participating in the Possibility Wars. So, Jay, your thoughts on the elves?
Well, you've got your traditional elf flavors. There's your high elves, which are the magic civilized elves. And then you've got your wood elves, which are the we live in the woods, ranger type elves, one with nature. So it's really whether you go, I mean, it's Isle, so everyone does magic, but it's whether it's like elf specialized in magic or elf specialized in nature. Although obviously either one can do anything. A lot of it probably depends on what books you read first, because whenever I see these things, I think Qualinost, Sylvanost, but other people might say Mirkwood, whatever. But so those are your two flavors of elf. And I imagine there's not really any information that I recall about the Elven kingdoms in the Old Isle book offhand, and there's really little to no information on it in here. But uh, they, the elves did something naughty uh, at some point. They saw what happened to the dwarves. They were a part. It does mention because the elves are long lived. They can live up to 1,000 years old. So they don't really think too much of humans for the most case. So like even dwarves, they just rate them as slightly better than goblins. So they are pretty haughty and everything, but they saw the dwarves just get completely trucked by Uthorian. And they knew that they were next. They had started losing settlements once Uthorian's forces came out from the underground and they could just appear sort of wherever. They were starting to lose ancient, immortal elven lives, which is so much worse than losing human lives. So the leaders basically agreed to parlay with Uthorian and trade their safety for a secret. And I don't know if Leamon wants to explain the secret or not.
Yeah, so in classic Torg, there was the Akashians that were known as the so-called space gods. In Torg Eternity, the Akashians visited and had ways of going to different cosms within the Cosmverse. And they had visited Core Earth at a point in time, and at some point in history, in Eilish history, they had visited and made contact with the Elves there. And as Jay said, there's not a lot mentioned about it, but one of the things that when the elders, the leaders of the Elves on Isle, looked at the dwarves, and even though, dwarves aren't as cool as we are, because nobody's as cool as we are, you have to understand the dwarves are a hardy, warrior, strong people, and just to see them get completely stomped and burned into the ground or underground, the elves got scared, and they were like, hey, don't hurt us, go after these people that can jump from reality to reality. And Uthorian, being Uthorian, and I will not go on my Uthorian rant, immediately ran to the Gaunt Man and said, hey, Gaunt Man, I got the secret. Here's all the information that these elves told me. I'm not going to use it for myself. But here, aren't I a good lapdog? Okay. And the Gaunt Man then chased after the Akashians and pretty much wiped them out after taking their and corrupting their biotechnology, and that's where you get the nightmare trees, the dim thread trees, the gospod seeds, etc. Once he got that information, destroyed the Akashians, pretty much so, to a point where he thought he actually had caused them to go extinct. But by doing so, Uthorian didn't bring his full force against the elves, and actually, you could say he lived up to his end of the deal.
Just the most surprising part of this whole thing. Really.
Right. So there is a group of elves that have guilt because of that. They realized our leaders saved their own and our bacon by letting another species, another race of people, sacrificing them and leading, them to the slaughter, because they didn't go and say, hey, Akashians, watch out, there's a guy coming after you that's really big and bad. And so those who had guilt, they went across or went through the land between, came up out of the Maelstrom underground bridge. I still want to call it a bridge, even though it's underground tunnels, or the Maelstrom tunnels.
It's a bridge. I mean, it's a bridge.
Yeah. There's also whirlpools.
Yeah, that they then
which are also bridges.
Came to Core Earth specifically because they bear the guilty feelings of that. So with elves, as a player and as a game master, remember you're probably going to have 99% of the elves on core Earth bear that guilt. Because if they didn't, they would be back on Isle, happy that Uthorian is going after humans and other champions of the light and leaving them alone because they ratted out the Akashans. So
I think also part of it was they also agreed not to help
right,
like the other denizens of Isle too.
Mm-hmm.
They just went full elven isolationist. Not our problem, and
Right.
that also rubbed it. So like when I
Yeah, but that's the core of the guilt, right? Because
Yeah.
they realized that they made a deal that essentially they sacrificed someone else to save
Yeah.
their own behinds, but that it's not really saving them. It's okay, I'm going to kill you last because the Gaunt Man there can't be another challenge, and the elves are legitimate. The elves have a legitimate power, and then huh?
I mean, some might say that the elves who made these decisions and continue to live there like that may be getting marks of darkness.
Well,
Yeah.
I would think certainly,
Yeah.
but their arrival with the Army of Light, or their rally around Ardnay's call for the Army of Light and heroes to come to Core Earth to help fight Uthorian at all, is they're showing up, and they put out a great front that oh no, they're champions of light because they have all this magical innate magic. We're Fae. Yeah, of course we have all this innate. We're linked to Isle. We can do all of this stuff, and as Leamon said, they're so much better than everybody else just because they're elves. And a lot of times, as a game master, you can hide the secret, the guilt, in that superiority complex that they have just by being elves. But deep down, they know that if that facade, that veneer is dug into just a little bit, somebody's going to see that it's something completely different. And wait a minute, there's something going on there, and they might start looking into that and start digging into the secret. And they absolutely cannot let that secret get out because the elves all know. They all know what they did, and if they didn't do it, they stood by and let their leaders do it because they didn't want to die either. And so they all share the guilt equally, either for action or inaction. And they all feel horrifically bad about it because they let somebody else die in their place. And now they're here to help us fight Uthorian. And what they tell us all about that they're here for is because, well, you need someone with our kind of power on your side. We can help you beat them. What they're really motivated for is they've got to make amends, because while the dwarves have eschewed their gods and their deities, they feel really, really bad because they know their gods and their deities know what they did and they don't like it, and they need to atone for that. And so they're here to try and make up for it. And I don't know, I haven't made up in my mind about whether or not they are actually, if anything they can do here actually can make up for that. But that's what they're trying, in my opinion, that's what they're trying to do.
That's actually one of the, I guess, the big issues that you need to think about if you're an elf. Technically, the guilt of the elves is supposed to be a secret, but like the elves don't talk about
right.
it.
If
But
you
we
have
all know, yeah, like we all know how player characters are, though, right?
and a player should know if their character has this secret, but they're also trying to keep it a secret. So it's like you
Yeah.
feel guilt because of this thing. The other Storm Knights don't know. The other players might.
Yeah,
But your character doesn't want them to know, because then that would
Correct.
reflect badly on them.
they shouldn't tell.
And the
people.
world of Torg Eternity, no one knows this but the elves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a okay, well, this is where we get the elf to tell everybody, and so it's out. I would think that the elves would not look kindly on an elf that let the secret out.
Mm-hmm.
That would not end well for them.
Though I
So-
kind of imagine, with the amount of mind reading that exists in this game, that by the end of year one, it might be kind of like an open secret. Like some people know, some don't.
But again, that's where we go, because when you mind read, you get a willpower, right? And the elves are super. That's their thing. I mean, they're magically inclined, so I would think that
Mm-hmm.
would be a very high, just as high in game terms. That would be just as high on the elf side as it would be on the people who can mind read. And so you would have an elf who suddenly know, wait, get out of my head, and you didn't get anything, and so now they maybe take great offense to someone
Of
to the
course.
point where this guy could find out. I might see an elf turning to violence to that
Oh
point
yeah.
against
Yeah.
someone who might potentially reveal that secret. And so if somebody's probing, if I'm an elf trying to keep this great stigma quiet and somebody's starting to poke around in my head, specifically getting close to that, I might get to the point where if threats of violence don't work, of like taking their life if I had to. Now that's not a hero thing to do, and I'm not condoning PvP in the game system. In fact, at my table, you're not allowed to have PvP. So that's not where that goes, and I wouldn't encourage GMs to bring that out. But from a player standpoint, you have to understand that that's the reaction you're going to get if you're a mind reader and you start digging into your fellow Storm Knight elf and their head, that you should expect violence from them, because it's justified, in my opinion.
Yeah. So the another thing
Yeah.
I wanted to
I was just waiting to see if Leamon
No.
took it.
no, I was just gonna say that is a thing that if you're playing an elf, this is your secret, this is your guilt, but it's not somebody going around, oh, my guilt, my guilt, my guilt. They're keeping it inside. It's an internal thing, because if an elf who is superior to everybody else shows that, hey, our the whole elfdom is, has this guilt, it reflects poorly on them, the best people out there. So they don't want that, and they don't want other people to know that. And
You lesser races have no need to know this.
It's not the kind of thing you start moaning about after a couple of
Right.
pints.
right.
You know?
What does the pity of a human mean to an elf? Nothing.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
And then there's a sidebar in the Isle sourcebook on page 41 that actually talks about the gods and the guilt of the elves, and how each of the deities of Isle reacted to the betrayal. It says here, the betrayal of the Akashians, where the evil gods, like Korbal, was, yeah, go, just let a whole entire, spacefaring species of
It's the
reality
patron god of the necromancer,
jumping,
by the way.
get obliterated. That's awesome. And then, like, the good deity of magic, Dunad, he was rooting for the elves, of like, they're going to do the good thing, they're going to do the right thing. Oh, wait, they did the wrong thing. Oh, I don't like them as much anymore. So you have the deities reacting to that. And unlike the dwarves, who just completely were like, screw you, deities, we're going to do our own thing, the elves still have some ties to...
They still care.
They care what the deities think. So, that is another higher guilt, placed upon them. That's the guilt that they're also afraid of, is what the higher powers of Isle think about them. So
There was also an additional metaphysical consequence of the guilt as well, because in Isle there used to be what the elves call awakened forests, where the trees could talk and the animals could talk, and there was like fey spirits and all sorts of things. But ever since they made that pact with Uthorian, the woods went quiet. The animals kind of lost their special abilities. The wardens, how they have the
spirit wolves,
white
or
wolves,
white
the
wolves,
white wolves. Like, they used to be spirit wolves. They used to be ethereal creatures with all kinds of powers, but they were just kind of turned into white wolves, which were a slightly more intelligent, just regular wolf, essentially. But then when the elves came through to Oxford, most of them started to hear like a calling from somewhere else on core Earth, and many of them traveled to
Ireland, right?
Yeah, it's Elfing, as it's now known, because it's basically they just moved in and
Yes.
because Uthorian did a fair number there, but the elves, like almost all of the elves that came to Core Earth, were kind of like, okay, well, we did some fighting for you, Ardnay, peace. We're going to Ireland here, because they found that in the transformation, or at least just even not even transformation, but just the raising of the magic axiom has caused the woods in Elfame to awaken, just like the old woods of Olden Isle. And now you have spirit wolves returning, and you've got Core Earth Fae that treat the elves as equals, and it's like an entirely new thing. So kind of like how I was talking about in my game, the dwarves have a little bit of hope now. It's kind of the same thing, but actually in the setting is that these elves have come here, and it's like, oh, there's actually maybe a future.
I got my Disney
Yeah.
princess status restored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's sort of like it's Core Earth's big thing, right? Like there's
Right.
the law of the underdog, law of glory. And it's the same deal in Ororsh, right? There's the glory perks like that can wipe out corruption. And so it's something that the other High Lords haven't really had to deal with, and it's the same with aspirants in Tharcold. Like they come to Core Earth and you see like, wait, actually maybe we can win. You know, there is hope.
And Elfheim in Ireland, even more so from the elves' perspective, this is almost like, hey, we're at the beginning. You know, we lived in the ancient, and we were in the ancient, and we know what the venerable looks like, and we trashed it, we screwed it up, and here we see the beginnings, the genesis of the ancient, and if that means that we're the ones who are going to guide this into what it becomes for later generations to revere. And so they maybe have taken that on as this if we do this right, we can grow this into what was before and even better. And so they're looking at that, trying to regain that in a sense they're almost getting their honor back through guiding this, because it's natural for Ireland. That's the storyline, is that in the Axiom Wash, this isn't something that's new. This is just a reawakening of what was there already in Ireland, lying dormant, and now it's coming back. And so they're getting to guide and shepherd and I guess warden. Again, it's not the right word. I can't figure it. Anyway, they're trying to grow this into what it is, as a guardians of this new thing that's going to grow into something amazing.
But it's a shame there's all these humans living here.
Yeah, well, they hey, we'll work on that.
I see it also as again, the elves who feel the guilt the most, they're the ones who came across. And by getting this hope, like Jay said, and this new chance, it is a second chance of actually being a good steward to the land.
Steward, there you go. That's the word.
The old land rejected us. This one is accepting us. Let's now actually do something positive with it. You know, let's correct our mistakes and that. We're not going to tell anybody our mistakes, because, man, if we tell these trees and these fairies and stuff here, they might stop talking to us too. So
they might throw us out because they might be worried we'd do it to them too.
Right. So that's just I find the dynamic between the horrible thing that happened to the dwarves chaining down to what the elves, the elf betrayal of the Akashians, and then the guilt. So the dwarves, they're on a vengeance and a righting a wrong that was done to them, where the elves have the guilt and the wrong of what they did to somebody else. And that's a little bit different than a lot of fantasies. I mean, in Tolkien, we have the Mines of Moria, and they lost, and they're going for vengeance. It's almost like, what if the whole, every single dwarf was that had happened to, not just one kingdom or one clan in Torg Eternity. And then the elf thing I find very interesting. because that's just usually not something that I've seen in other fantasy works. I mean, I might not have read something that it's there in, but that's not something I'm aware of.
So let me ask you a question, Leamon, because I think I'm blending, and I don't know that I am. So you can square me away here, but am I blending Pella Ardenae's history that a Thorian possessed her in Torg Eternity, or is that just classic Torg?
Both.
It's both. Okay, good. So here's the question. Uthorian possessed Pella Ardenae, and so Ardenae wasn't turned off while he was in there. She was just shoved in the back, as far as I know. And so she was kind of like a ride along, seeing it all and kind of knowing what he's doing and seeing all of everything. Does Pella Ardenae know what the elves did?
That might be something that needs to be looked into, because Uthorian can also jump bodies. So it depends on what form he was in when he met with those elves at the time.
And even if he had conversations later, or if she's, because he's in her and he knows what she knows, does she know what he knows? And all of a sudden now we've got, and Ardenae hasn't let, if she does, because there's nothing in TE lore that says one way or the other. If she knows, she's kept quiet this whole time.
Yeah.
So there's the potential that Pella Ardenae knows what the elves did.
There's a potential
that's kind of interesting.
Might be somewhat aware.
And so does several other people.
It's possible.
Anybody that Uthorian has populated, possessed, whatever you want to say it.
Well, we don't know the mechanics of that possession necessarily.
So,
agreed. I'm just saying the potential is there.
Yeah, the potential is her, or I mean, you could go the opposite extreme: is he jumped bodies, went there with somebody else, jumped out, and immediately had them killed because he didn't want that known, you know.
Well, yeah,
but it's
Vikings. It doesn't really matter because they're bad guys. But
it's at least the elves, Uthorian, and the Gaunt Man at minimum. Those would be
at
the
minimum.
At minimum.
That's yes.
What you're higher than that currently would be up to each individual game master. So, yeah. So a bunch
of alpha class storm knights filling up a crystal spire.
Right. Or went on a certain adventure that had mentioned the Akashans, and I think it even had pictures or pictographs or something of the Akashans meeting some little, hieroglyphic type people with pointy ears. So, again, we do thank you for either watching or listening to us, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode about dwarves and elves and can make either your game as a game master fit everything better, or as a player give you some ideas on how you might want to play your dwarf or elf. Again, we do encourage you to write us at torgdcd@gmail.com, where we can read your emails and answer questions like we did with Daniel earlier, or if you just comment, then we'll comment back, and if we get a lot or enough, then we can have another mailbag episode like last episode. I guess I should say there was one question that I found funny that was on the YouTube that asked about the last episode is, what is a Stallinger? So in classic Torg, a Stallinger was a floating, flying, big starfish with little tentacles that couldn't talk, and it was quite not liked by most game masters and players who saw no point in them whatsoever. They were flatly not going to be in Torg Eternity. They appeared as an April Fool's joke on one of the early April Fool's things. And then since my brother convinced me to let him play one, I put them in the Paraverse, my Infiniverse exchange product, and then Ulysses said the only way that they would ever be official is if a backer doing the backer archetypes chose that, and somebody did, of course. So that's how
Naturally.
they got in. They officially got into Torg Eternity. Very similar, I guess, to other companies where you have an April Fool's joke something, and then it actually becomes official later. So, again, thank you very much for either watching or listening. And until next time, we hope you have fun in your own Cosmverse. Bye.